On April 12th, the Finance Ministry announced that Sri Lanka was suspending normal debt servicing for an interim period pending an orderly and consensual restructuring. Sri Lanka has now defaulted on its debt. But what does it mean when a country defaults on its debt? Think of it in terms of a person who borrows more than he can afford to repay for a house or a car loan and is then forced to declare bankruptcy. However, a sovereign nation is not subject to normal bankruptcy laws and always has the ability to reject responsibility for its debt. So why doesn't a heavily indebted nation simply tell its creditors, "I'm no longer going to pay you," without any further information? If a nation does this, it's called a disorderly default. This nation will have very little ability to raise investment and loans in the future, and any that it does get will be at cripplingly high interest rates. This is because the confidence of international creditors in the nation will be exceedingly low. This happened in Lebanon in 2020, when the nation defaulted on its loans and was unable to present a plan for recovery or obtain an IMF bailout due to political paralysis. So, what does going to the IMF mean for Sri Lanka? Although we have never defaulted on debt post-independence, we are no strangers to the IMF and have thus far obtained their assistance 16 times. For Sri Lanka today, going to the IMF is part of a structured default. Most nations prefer structured default, ideally one that takes place while the nation still has sufficient foreign exchange reserves that can be used for repayment. Thus, the nation has negotiating power. The IMF, contrary to popular belief, is not just going to provide this nation with an unconditional loan. The nation will have to restructure its debt, often in conjunction with the IMF, in a manner that leaves it with a sustainable debt level, which is also acceptable to creditors. In exchange for this, the IMF and other international organizations such as the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank will provide the nation with a bailout and other loans provided at concessionary rates, which will tide it over until the economy begins to recover. This process will also include mandates for the nation to reform parts of its economy to hopefully avoid getting into unsustainable debt in the future. While this agreement would also lead to the nation's credit rating being downgraded and it having to face higher interest rates when borrowing in the future, the repercussions would not be as severe as if it underwent a disorderly default. In Sri Lanka's case, a default was inevitable, and many economists feel that it should have been negotiated earlier while we still had sufficient forex reserves. This would have obtained Sri Lanka more favorable terms at the negotiating table, as well as avoiding the massive shortages of essential goods that we are currently undergoing. But it is better that the government announces a structured default now, rather than waiting until we have completely run out of reserves and have no plan for repayment. In other words, a disorderly default. The three main types of international creditors that we have to negotiate with are: 1. Multilateral official creditors. This includes the World Bank and regional development banks, such as the Asian Development Bank. They may provide financing throughout the restructuring process and may be more willing to take larger losses on loans that have already been provided. 2. Bilateral official creditors. These are sovereign states that directly disburse loans or trade credits with each other. These creditors may regard their debts to be more important than those of commercial creditors, as they are ostensibly provided for public policy purposes, such as for crisis response or trade development. For their part, commercial creditors challenge this by arguing that bilateral loans are often given as part of a geopolitical agenda or to further exports. Finally, commercial creditors are dominated by institutions such as banks or funds, which either purchase sovereign bonds with the intention of holding them to maturity, which is when the issuer will pay them back, or on the secondary market at a significant discount when it appears that the debtor is close to default, as was the case in Sri Lanka. There are also vulture funds that may attempt to reject a negotiation and directly sue the debtor country in order to gain a higher profit. This happened in Argentina in 2005, and this can severely disrupt a restructuring, and debtors have developed methods to evade these tactics. Finally, there are less savvy retail and individual investors who are less able to bear a significant loss. So, what are we negotiating with our creditors? While this is a complex issue, what we are basically negotiating is 1. What loans and debt will be restructured? 2. What will the haircut be? The haircut is the percentage of debt that doesn't have to be repaid. 3. What will the relief period, which is the time in which we don't have to make payments, be? However, creditors are not completely out of options during this time. For example, if they wish, they can obtain payments in rupees. The negotiation and restructuring process will take 9 months or more according to experts, but can take a year or more. As mentioned earlier, we may need help from the IMF and other organizations and countries to just stay afloat during that time. At the time of writing, initial talks with the IMF, with the support of India, have broached the possibility of Sri Lanka obtaining a rapid financing instrument. This is basically an emergency fund to keep the country afloat for the next few months. In the longer term, the IMF will first appoint a legal advisor to assist the government to initiate debt restructuring, and will then undertake a debt sustainability analysis. A debt sustainability analysis will basically analyze all government debt, potential reforms or policy adjustments, and the availability of finance. If both the IMF board and the government agree to these conditions, the IMF will likely provide loans as part of an extended fund facility. The EFF is a sum of money that we will obtain in installments over 4 to 10 years and will come with strict conditions as part of an adjustment program. This will help Sri Lanka overcome its BOP or balance of payments crisis and allow it to eventually pay the IMF, as well as creating socio-economic stability, which we are seriously lacking. When the negotiations are at an advanced stage, the IMF will then grant their seal of approval, and confidence among creditors will increase. We will then be able to obtain further loans at a manageable interest rate. The IMF and other stakeholders and advisors will generally exclude some types of debt from restructuring. This includes trade credits due to the necessity of maintaining trade flows, senior/mature debts, and treasury bills, as the debtor government needs short-term financing. However, even when undergoing a structured default, there are still a number of factors that can go wrong. For example, it can take too long to be negotiated and implemented. This could be because the debtor government finds it politically popular to be confrontational with creditors and demand unrealistically large haircuts. Alternatively, individual creditors may attempt to stall negotiations, as the ability of the government to pay them in full will increase as other creditors agree to large haircuts. Finally, due to both creditors and debtors not knowing where exactly to compromise on haircuts and relief periods, negotiations may drag on. This final factor may lead to a situation where the debtor does not obtain enough relief, the creditor extracts an excessive amount of relief, or the restructuring may be seen as coercive. The net result of all of these potential delays and miscommunications is that the debtor country's credit rating and access to investment and international financial markets could be negatively affected for years to come. Unfortunately, the reforms that will have to be enacted during the negotiation phase will be painful for many Sri Lankan citizens and firms. These include stopping both money printing and artificially holding down the currency. When money printing stops, it will mean that domestic interest rates must rise to meet the government financing requirement. The currency must also be allowed to find a market rate. But this should have been done together with a steep increase in interest rates and the removal of the surrender requirement to allow the market to start functioning properly. This would also ideally have happened with some commitment to an IMF program to give investors more confidence. Since the currency was freed without a proper anchor, it has overcorrected and depreciated more than necessary. Other reforms, including raising taxes, reforming the bloated public sector, and so on, will also be extremely politically unpopular, but nonetheless necessary to prevent money printing. The public sector thus far was running on a bubble of printed money. Financing it from taxes and borrowing will be very painful, so it also makes sense to cut waste and unnecessary expenses as well. Again, it would have been preferable if these reforms had taken place earlier. However, by relying on short-term fixes, the problems were allowed to fester. Nonetheless, it's better late than never. However, it should be emphasized again that this process, no matter how painful, was inevitable and has been inevitable for many years. If drawn out unnecessarily, it can damage the debtor country's reputation, reduce investor confidence, create a banking crisis, and shut off access to international markets and finance. If we follow a competent, thorough, and swift restructuring process with good faith negotiations, it is likely that Sri Lanka will be well on the process to recovery in just a few months or years. If you found this video informative and would like to find out more, please follow us on our social media platforms. Also, if you'd like to support us so we can continue to make videos like this, please visit us at support.advocata.org.